Welcome back to Mental Wealth Reads. This is, of course, the next video episode of Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. We're going to be starting, not only starting part 2, but chapter 7, which is pretty exciting. This section will now get into, as I mentioned last time, it'll start getting into the parts of this book where we talk about recovery, right? How do we bounce back from trauma? What do we do with that? What do we do about it? I think what I am also most excited about this section in this chapter is that we'll start to give you all an idea of what it's like to be on the therapist's end of this experience too. There's going to be some stuff in this upcoming chapter where you hear a lot about just our experience, right? What we go through, helping people with trauma. And it's not to say that this chapter will pull the attention away from the people experiencing trauma or the people coming to help for trauma. It's not that at all. It's more just kind of giving more context to just how much or how important it is for your therapist to be someone who is also very mindful of themselves and able to understand the sensitivities of the room, right? To be able to provide for you the atmosphere that you need in order to heal. So without further ado, we'll move right in. Chapter 7, A Healing Relationship. The core experiences of psychological trauma are disempowerment and disconnection from others. Recovery, therefore, is based upon the empowerment of the survivor and the creation of new connections. Recovery can take place only within the context of relationships. It cannot occur in isolation. In her renewed connections with other people, the survivor recreates the psychological faculties that were damaged or deformed by the traumatic experience. These faculties include the basic capacities for trust, autonomy, initiative, competence, identity, and intimacy. Just as these capabilities are originally formed in relationships with other people, they must be reformed in such relationships. The first principle of recovery is the empowerment of the survivor. She must be the author and arbiter of her own recovery. Others may offer advice, support, assistance, affection, and care, but not cure. Many benevolent and well-intentioned attempts to assist the survivor flounder because this fundamental principle of empowerment is not observed. No intervention that takes power away from the survivor can possibly foster her recovery, no matter how much it appears to be in her immediate best interest. In the words of an incest survivor, good therapists were those who really validated my experience and helped me to control my behavior rather than trying to control me. Caregivers schooled in a medical model of treatment often have difficulty grasping this fundamental principle and putting it into practice. In exceptional circumstances, where the survivor has totally abdicated responsibility for her own self-care or threatens immediate harm to herself or to others, rapid intervention is required with or without her consent. But even then, there is no need for unilateral action. The survivor should still be consulted about her wishes and offered as much choice as is compatible with the preservation of safety. This principle of restoring control to the traumatized person has been widely recognized. Abram Gardner defines the role of the therapist as that of an assistant to the patient, whose goal is to help the patient complete the job that he is trying to do spontaneously, and to reinstate the element of renewed control. Martin Simons, working with hostages, describes the principles of treatment as restoring power to victims, reducing isolation, diminishing helplessness by increasing the victim's range of choice, and countering the dynamics of dominance in the approach to the victim. The community activists Evan Stark and Anne Flitcraft state as their therapeutic goal with battered women the restoration of autonomy and empowerment. They define autonomy as a sense of separateness, flexibility, and self-possession sufficient to define one's self-interest. and make significant choices, while empowerment is the convergence of mutual support with individual autonomy. From their perspective, the same woman who looks like a helpless and deteriorated patient in the traditional medical or mental health clinic may look and act like a strong survivor in a shelter environment where her experience is validated and her strengths are recognized and encouraged. The relationship between survivor and therapist is one relationship among many. It is by no means the only or even the best relationship in which recovery is fostered. Traumatized people are often reluctant to ask for help of any kind, let alone psychotherapy. But many people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder do eventually seek help from the mental health system. For example, a national study of Vietnam veterans found that most combat veterans with post-traumatic syndrome sought treatment for mental health problems at least once after their return from the war. The therapy relationship is unique in several respects. First, its sole purpose is to promote the recovery of the patient. In the furtherance of this goal, the therapist becomes the patient's ally, placing all the resources of her knowledge, skill, and experience at the patient's disposal. Second, the therapy relationship is unique because of the contract between patient and therapist regarding the use of power. The patient enters therapy in need of help and care. By virtue of this fact, she voluntarily submits herself to an unequal relationship in which the therapist has superior status and power. Feelings related to the universal childhood experience of dependence on a patient or on a parent are inevitably aroused. These feelings, known as transference, further exaggerate the power imbalance in the therapeutic relationship and render all patients vulnerable to exploitation. It is the therapist's responsibility to use the power that has been conferred upon her only to foster the recovery of the patient, resisting all temptations to abuse. This promise, which is central to the integrity of any therapeutic relationship, is of special importance to patients who are already suffering as a result of another's arbitrary and exploitative exercise of power. In entering the treatment relationship, the therapist promises to respect the patient's autonomy by remaining disinterested and neutral. Disinterested means that the therapist abstains from using her power over the patient to gratify her personal needs. Neutral means that the therapist does not take sides in the patient's inner conflicts or try to direct the patient's life decisions. Constantly reminding herself that the patient is in charge of her own life, the therapist refrains from advancing a personal agenda. The disinterested and neutral stance is an ideal to be striven for, never perfectly attained. The technical neutrality of the therapist is not the same as moral neutrality. Working with victimized people requires a committed moral stance. The therapist is called upon to bear witness to a crime. She must affirm a position of solidarity with the victim. This does not mean a simplistic notion that the victim can do no wrong. Rather, it involves an understanding of the fundamental injustice of the traumatic experience and the need for a resolution that restores some sense of justice. This affirmation expresses itself in the therapist's daily practice, in her language, and above all, in her moral commitment to truth-telling without evasion or disguise. Yale Danieli, a psychologist who works with survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, assumes this moral stance even in the routine process of taking a family history. When survivors speak of their relatives who died, she affirms that they were rather murdered. Therapists and researchers who work with members of survivors' families encounter individuals whom the Holocaust deprived of the normal cycle of generations and ages. The Holocaust also robbed them, and still does, of natural individual death, and thus of normal mourning. The use of the word death to describe the fate of the survivors' relatives, friends, and communities appears to be a defense against acknowledging murder as possibly the most crucial reality of the Holocaust. The therapist's role is both intellectual and relational, fostering both insight and empathic connection. Gardner notes that the central part of the therapy should also be to enlighten the patient as to the nature and meaning of his symptoms, but at the same time, the attitude of the physician in treating these cases is that of protecting the patient. He must help the patient reclaim his grip on the outer world, which can never be done by a perfunctory pill-dispensing attitude. The psychoanalyst Otto Kernberg makes similar observations on the treatment of patients with borderline personality disorder. The therapist's empathic attitude, derived from his emotional understanding of himself and from his transitory identification with and concern for the patient, has elements in common with the empathy of the good enough mother with her infant. There is, however, also a totally rational, cognitive, almost aesthetic aspect of the therapist's work with the patient which gives their relationship a completely different quality. The alliance of therapy cannot be taken for granted. It must be painstakingly built by the effort of both patient and therapist. Therapy requires a collaborative working relationship in which both partners act on the basis of their implicit confidence in the value and efficacy of persuasion rather than coercion, ideas rather than force, mutuality rather than authoritarian control. These are precisely the benefits that have been shattered by the traumatic experience. Trauma damages the patient's ability to enter into a trusting relationship. It also has an indirect but powerful impact on the therapist. As a result, both patient and therapist will have predictable difficulties coming to a working alliance. These difficulties must be understood and anticipated from the outset. Traumatic transference. Patients who suffer from a traumatic syndrome form a characteristic type of transference in the therapy relationship. Their emotional responses to any person in a position of authority have been deformed by the experience of terror. For this reason, traumatic transference reactions have an intense, life or death quality unparalleled in ordinary therapeutic experience. In Kernberg's words, it is as if the patient's life depends on keeping the therapist under control. Some of the most astute observations on the vicissitudes of traumatic transference appear in the classic accounts of the treatment of borderline personality disorder, written when the traumatic origin of the disorder was not yet known. In these accounts, a destructive force appears to intrude repeatedly into the relationship between therapist and patient. This force, which was traditionally attributed to the patient's innate aggression, can now be recognized as the violence of the perpetrator. The psychiatrist Eric Lister remarks that the transference in traumatized patients does not reflect a simple dyadic relationship, but rather a triad. The terror is as though the patient and therapist convene in the presence of yet another person. The third image is the victimizer, who demanded silence and whose command is now being broken. The traumatic transference reflects not only the experience of terror, but also the experience of helplessness. At the moment of trauma, the victim is utterly helpless. Unable to defend herself, she cries for help, but no one comes to her aid. She feels totally abandoned. The memory of this experience pervades all subsequent relationships. The greater the patient's emotional conviction of helplessness and abandonment, the more desperately she feels the need for an omnipotent rescuer. Often she casts the therapist in this role. She may develop intensely idealized expectations of the therapist. The idealization of the therapist protects the patient, in fantasy, against reliving the terror of the trauma. In one successful case, both patient and therapist came to understand the terror at the source of the patient's demand for rescue. The therapist remarked, "It's frightening to need someone so much and not be able to control them." The patient was moved and continued this thought. "It's frightening because you can kill me with what you say, or by not caring, or by leaving." The therapist then added, "We can see why you need me to be perfect." When the therapist fails to live up to these idealized expectations, as she inevitably will fail, the patient is often overcome with fury. Because the patient feels as though her life depends upon her rescuer, she cannot afford to be tolerant. There is no room for human error. The traumatized person's helpless, desperate rage at a rescuer who lapses even momentarily from her role is illustrated in the case of the Vietnam veteran Tim O'Brien, who describes how he felt after being wounded in battle. "The need for revenge kept eating at me. At night, I sometimes drank too much. I'd remember getting shot and yelling out for a medic, and then waiting and waiting and waiting, passing out once, then waking up and screaming some more, and how the screaming seemed to make new pain, the awful stink of myself, the sweat and fear, Bobby Jorgensen's clumsy fingers when he finally got around to working on me. I kept going over it all, every detail. I wanted to yell, "You jerk, it's shock, I'm dying," but all I could do was whinny and squeal. I remembered that, and the hospital, and the nurses. I even remembered the rage, but I couldn't feel it anymore. In the end, all I felt was that coldness down inside my chest. Number 1, the guy had almost killed me. Number 2, there had to be consequences. This testimony reveals not only the helpless rage of the victim in terror of death, but also the displacement of his rage from perpetrator to caregiver. He feels that the medic, not the enemy, almost killed him, further compounding his fury and his sense of humiliation and shame. Though he desperately needs the rescuer's help, he is mortified to be seen in his defiled physical condition. As his wounds heal in the hospital, he broods on a plan of revenge, not against the enemy, but against the inept rescuer. Many traumatized people feel similar rage at the caregivers who try to help them and harbor similar fantasies of revenge. In these fantasies, they wish to reduce the disappointing, envied therapist to the same unbearable condition of terror, helplessness, and shame that they themselves have suffered. Though the traumatized patient feels a desperate need to rely on the integrity and competence of the therapist, she cannot do so, for her capacity to trust has been damaged by the traumatic experience. Whereas in other therapeutic relationships, some degree of trust may be presumed from the outset. This presumption is never warranted in the treatment of traumatized patients. The patient enters the therapeutic relationship prey to every sort of doubt and suspicion. She generally assumes that the therapist is either unwilling or unable to help. Until proven otherwise, she assumes that the therapist cannot bear to hear the true story of the trauma. Combat veterans will not form a trusting relationship until they are convinced that the therapist can stand to hear the details of the war story. Rape survivors, hostages, political prisoners, battered women, and Holocaust survivors feel a similar mistrust of the therapist's ability to listen. In the words of one incest survivor, these therapists sound like they have all the answers, but they back away from the real shitty stuff. At the same time, however, the patient mistrusts the motives of any therapist who does not back away. She may attribute to the therapist many of the same motives as the perpetrator. She often suspects the therapist of exploitative or voyeuristic intentions. Where the trauma has been repeated and prolonged, the patient's expectations of perverse or malevolent intent can prove especially resistant to change. Patients who have been subject to chronic trauma and therefore suffer from a complex post-traumatic syndrome also have complex transference reactions. The protracted involvement with the perpetrator has altered the patient's relational style, so that she not only fears repeated victimization, but also seems unable to protect herself from it, or even appears to invite it. The dynamics of dominance and submission are reenacted in all subsequent relationships, including the therapy. Chronically traumatized patients have an exquisite attunement to unconscious and nonverbal communication. Accustomed over a long time to reading their captors' emotional and cognitive states, survivors bring this ability into the therapy relationship. Kernberg notes the borderline patient's uncanny ability to read the therapist and respond to the therapist's vulnerability. Emmanuel Tenay notes the sensitivity and intense perceptiveness of survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, adding that fluctuations in attention of the therapist are picked up by these patients with readiness and pathological hypersensitivity. The patient scrutinizes the therapist's every word and gesture in an attempt to protect herself from the hostile reaction she expects. Because she has no confidence in the therapist's benign intentions, she persistently misinterprets the therapist's motives and reactions. The therapist may eventually react to these hostile attributions in unaccustomed ways. Drawn into the dynamics of dominance and submission, the therapist may inadvertently reenact aspects of the abusive relationships. This dynamic, which has been most extensively studied in borderline patients, has been attributed to the patient's defensive style of protective identification. Once again, the perpetrator plays a shadow role in this type of interaction. When the original trauma is known, the therapist may find an uncanny similarity between the original trauma and its reenactment in therapy. Frank Putnam describes one such instance in a patient with multiple personality disorder. As a child, the patient had been repeatedly tied up and forced to perform fellatio on her father. During her last hospitalizations, she became severely suicidal and anorexic. The staff members tried to feed her through a nasogastric tube, but she kept pulling it out. Consequently, they felt compelled to place her in four-way restraints. The patient was now tied to her bed and having a tube forced down her throat, all in the name of saving her life. Once the similarity of these therapeutic interventions to her earlier abuse was pointed out to all parties, it became possible to discontinue the forced feedings. The reenactment of the relationship with the perpetrator is most evident in the sexualized transference that sometimes emerges in survivors of prolonged childhood sexual abuse. The patient may assume that the only value she can possibly have in the eyes of another, especially in the eyes of a powerful person, is as a sexual object. Here, for example, a therapist describes the final session of a long and successful treatment of an incest survivor who had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. She now felt like a grown-up daughter. Still, if she did not have intercourse with me, perhaps it was because she was not sexy enough. In the final session, she wondered if I could know how much she appreciated the therapy if she did nothing except thank me verbally. At the door, she realized that perhaps thanking me was sufficient. It was 7 years after our first meeting. Patients may be quite direct about their desire for a sexual relationship. A few patients may actually demand such a relationship as the only convincing proof of the therapist caring. At the same time, even these patients dread a reenactment of the sexual relationship in therapy. Such a reenactment simply confirms the patient's belief that all human relationships are corrupt. The patient with multiple personality disorder represents the extreme in the complications of traumatic transference. The transference may be highly fragmented, with different components carried by different alters. Putnam suggests that therapists working with these patients prepare for intensely hostile and sexualized transferences as a matter of routine. Even in patients who lack such extreme dissociative capacities, the transference may be disorganized and fragmented, subject to the frequent oscillations that are the hallmark of the traumatic syndromes. The emotional vicissitudes of the recovery relationship are therefore bound to be unpredictable and confusing for patient and therapist alike. Traumatic countertransference. Trauma is contagious. In the role of witness to disaster or atrocity, the therapist at times is emotionally overwhelmed. She experiences to a lesser degree the same terror, rage, and despair as the patient. This phenomenon is known as traumatic countertransference, or vicarious traumatization. The therapist may begin to experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Hearing the patient's trauma story is bound to revive any personal trauma experiences that the therapist may have suffered in the past. She may also notice imagery associated with the patient's story intruding into her own waking fantasies or dreams. In one case, a therapist began to have the same grotesque nightmares as her patient, Arthur, a 35-year-old man who had been sadistically abused in childhood by his father. Arthur told his therapist that he still feared his father, even though he had been dead for 10 years. He felt that his father was watching him and could control him from beyond the grave. He believed that the only way to overcome his father's demonic power was to unearth his body and drive a stake through his heart. The therapist began to have vivid nightmares of Arthur's father entering her room in the form of a rotting, disinterred body. Engaging in this work thus poses some risk to the therapist's own psychological health. The therapist's adverse reactions, unless understood and contained, also predictably lead to disruptions in the therapeutic alliance with patients and to conflict with professional colleagues. Therapists who work with the traumatized people require an ongoing support system to deal with these intense reactions. Just as no survivor can recover alone, no therapist can work with trauma alone. Traumatic countertransference includes the entire range of the therapist's emotional reactions to the survivor and to the traumatic event itself. Among therapists working with survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, Danieli observes an almost impersonal uniformity of emotional responses. She suggests that the Holocaust itself, rather than the individual personalities of therapists or patients, is the primary source of these reactions. This interpretation recognizes the shadow presence of the perpetrator in the relationship between patient and therapist and traces the countertransference, like the transference, to its original source outside of a simple dyadic relationship. In addition to suffering vicarious symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, the therapist has to struggle with the same disruptions in relationship as the patient. Repeated exposure to stories of human rapacity and cruelty inevitably challenges the therapist's basic faith. It also heightens her sense of personal vulnerability. She may become more fearful of other people in general and more distrustful even in close relationships. She may find herself becoming increasingly cynical about the motives of others and pessimistic about the human condition. The therapist also empathically shares the patient's experience of helplessness. This may lead to the therapist to underestimate the value of her own knowledge and skill, or to lose sight of the patient's strengths and resources. Under the sway of countertransference helplessness, the therapist may also lose confidence in the power of the psychotherapy relationship. It is not uncommon for experienced therapists to feel suddenly incompetent and hopeless in the face of a traumatized patient. Putnam describes experienced therapists as feeling intimidated and de-skilled when they encounter a patient with multiple personality disorder. Similar feelings arise among those who work with survivors of extreme political violence and repression. The case of Irene, a victim of sexual terrorism, illustrates a temporary therapeutic stalemate occasioned by the therapist's loss of confidence. Irene, a 24-year-old woman, came into treatment complaining of a post-traumatic syndrome with prominent hyperarousal, intrusive symptoms, and severe constriction. Previously sociable, she had withdrawn from most activities and was virtually a prisoner in her home. A year previously, she had fought off a rape attempt on a date. Since that time, the perpetrator had harassed her with obscene, threatening late-night phone calls. He also stalked her and kept her house under surveillance, and she suspected that he had killed her cat. She had gone to the police once, but felt they had no interest in her problem since nothing had really happened. The therapist identified with Irene's frustration and helplessness. Doubting that psychotherapy had anything to offer, he found himself offering practical advice instead. Irene despondently rejected all of his suggestions, just as she had rejected suggestions from friends, family, and the police. She felt sure that the perpetrator would defeat anything she tried. Therapy was not helping either. Her symptoms worsened, and she began to report thoughts of suicide. Reviewing the case in supervision, the therapist realized that he, like Irene, had been overwhelmed with a feeling of helplessness. Consequently, he had lost confidence in the utility of listening, his basic skill. In the next session, he asked whether Irene had ever told anyone the whole story of what had happened to her. Irene said no one wanted to hear about it. People just wanted her to shape up and get back to normal. The therapist remarked that Irene must feel really alone, and wondered if she felt that she could not confide in him either. Irene burst into tears. She had indeed felt the therapist did not want to listen. In subsequent sessions, as Irene told her story, her symptoms gradually abated. She began to take more action to protect herself, mobilizing her friends and family, and finding more effective ways to get help from the police. Though she reviewed her new strategies with her therapist, she developed them primarily on her own initiative. As a defense against the unbearable feeling of helplessness the therapist may try to assume the role of a rescuer. The therapist may take on more and more of an advocacy role for the patient. By doing so, she implies that the patient is not capable of acting for herself. The more the therapist accepts the idea that the patient is helpless, the more she perpetuates the traumatic transference and disempowers the patient. Many seasoned and experienced therapists who are ordinarily scrupulously observant of the limits of the therapy relationship find themselves violating the bonds of therapy and assuming the role of a rescuer under the intense pressures of traumatic transference and countertransference. The therapist may feel obliged to extend the limits of therapy sessions or allow frequent emergency contacts between sessions. She may find herself answering phone calls late at night, on weekends, or even on vacations. Rarely do these extraordinary measures result in improvement. On the contrary, the more helpless, dependent, and incompetent the patient feels, generally the worse her symptoms become. Carried to its logical extreme, the therapist's defense against feelings of helplessness leads to a stance of grandiose specialness or omnipotence. Unless this tendency is analyzed and controlled, the potential for corrupting the therapy relationship is great. All sorts of extreme boundary violations, up to and including sexual intimacy, are frequently rationalized on the basis of the patient's desperate need for rescue and the therapist's extraordinary gifts as a rescuer. Henry Crystal, who works with survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, observes that the therapist's impulse to play God is as ubiquitous as it is pathogenic. The psychoanalysts John Maltzberger and Dan Bowie sound a familiar warning. The three most common narcissistic snares are the aspirations to heal all, know all, and love all. Since such gifts are no more accessible to the contemporary psychotherapist than they were to Faust, unless such trends are worked out, the therapist will be subjected to a sense of Faustian helplessness and discouragement, and tempted to solve his dilemma by resort to magical and destructive action. In addition to identifying with the victim's helplessness, the therapist identifies with the victim's rage. The therapist may experience the extremes of anger from inarticulate fury through the intermediate ranges of frustration and irritability to abstract righteous indignation. This anger may be directed not only at the perpetrator, but also at bystanders who failed to intercede, at colleagues who failed to understand, and generally at the larger society. Through empathic identification, the therapist may also become aware of the depths of the patient's rage and may become fearful of the patient. Once again, this countertransference reaction, if unanalyzed, can lead to the actions that disempower the patient. At one extreme, the therapist may preempt the patient's anger with her own, or at the other extreme, she may become too deferential toward the patient's anger. The case of Kelly, a survivor of childhood abuse, illustrates the error of adopting a placating stance toward the patient. Kelly, a 40-year-old woman with a long history of stormy relationships and unsuccessful psychotherapy, began a new therapy relationship with a goal of getting out of my anger. She persuaded her therapist that only unconditional acceptance of her anger could help her to develop trust. In session after session, Kelly berated her therapist, who felt intimidated and unable to set limits. Instead of developing trust, Kelly came to see the therapist as inept and incompetent. She complained that the therapist was just like her mother, who had helplessly tolerated her father's violence in her family. The therapist also identifies with the patient through the experience of profound grief. The therapist may feel as though she herself is in mourning. Leonard Schengold refers to the Via Dolorosa of psychotherapy with survivors. Therapists working with survivors of the Nazi Holocaust report being engulfed by anguish or sinking into despair. Unless the therapist has adequate support to bear his grief, she will not be able to fulfill her promise to bear witness and will withdraw emotionally from the therapeutic alliance. The psychiatrist Richard Malika describes how the staff of his Indo-Chinese refugee clinic nearly succumbed to the patient's despair. During the first year, the major task of treatment was to cope with the hopelessness of our patients. We learned that the hopeless feelings were extremely contagious. The situation improved as the staff realized they were becoming overwhelmed by their patients' stories. As our own experience deepened, a natural sense of humor and affection began to develop between ourselves and our patients. The funereal atmosphere was finally broken, not only after we witnessed that some of our patients had improved, but also after the staff recognized that many of our patients were infecting us with their hopelessness. Emotional identification with the experience of the victim does not exhaust the range of the therapist's traumatic countertransference. In her role as witness, the therapist is caught in a conflict between victim and perpetrator. She comes to identify not only with the feelings of the victim, but also with those of the perpetrator. While the emotions of the identification with the victim may be extremely painful for the therapist, those of identification with the perpetrator may be more horrifying to her, for they represent a profound challenge to her identity as a caring person. Sarah Haley, a social worker, describes her work with the combat veterans. The first task of treatment is for the therapist to confront his or her own sadistic feelings, not only in response to the patient, but in terms of his or her own potential as well. The therapist must be able to envision the possibility that, under extreme physical and psychic stress, or in an atmosphere of overt license and encouragement, he or she, too, might very well murder. Identification with the perpetrator may take many forms. The therapist may find herself becoming highly skeptical of the patient's story, or she may begin to minimize or rationalize the abuse. The therapist may feel revulsion and disgust at the patient's behavior, or she may become extremely judgmental and censorious when the patient fails to live up to some idealized notion of how a good victim ought to behave. She may begin to feel contempt for the patient's helplessness or paranoid fear of the patient's vindictive rage. She may have moments of frank hate and wish to be rid of the patient. Finally, the therapist may experience voyeuristic excitement, fascination, and even sexual arousal. Sexualized countertransference is a common experience, particularly for male therapists working with female patients who have been subjected to sexual violence. Crystal observes that the encounter with the traumatized patient forces therapists to come to terms with their own capacity for evil. What we cannot own up to, we may have to reject in others. Thus, the friendly, compassionate attitude which one regards as most helpful may be replaced by anger, disgust, scorn, pity, or shame. The examiner who acts out his anger is displaying a symptom of his own difficulty, as is the one who suffers from depression, or who has the need to overindulge or seduce the patient. What I have said is of course well known, but we must be especially alert to this problem in dealing with massively traumatized individuals, because of the extraordinary impact of their life stories. Finally, the therapist's emotional reactions include not only those identified with victim and perpetrator, but also those exclusive to the role of the unharmed bystander. The most profound and universal of these reactions is a form of witness guilt, similar to the patient's survivor guilt. In therapists who treat survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, for example, guilt is the most common countertransference reaction. The therapist may simply feel guilty for the fact that she was spared for the suffering that the patient had to endure. In consequence, she may have difficulty enjoying the ordinary comforts and pleasures of her own life. Additionally, she may feel that her own actions are faulty or inadequate. She may judge herself harshly for insufficient therapeutic zeal or social commitment and come to feel that only a limitless dedication can compensate for her shortcomings. If the therapist's bystander guilt is not properly understood and contained, she runs the risk of ignoring her own legitimate interests. In the therapy relationship, she may assume too much personal responsibility for the patient's life, thus again patronizing and disempowering the patient. In her work environment, she may similarly take on excessive responsibility with the attendant risk of eventual burnout. The therapist may also feel guilty for causing the patient to re-experience the pain of the trauma in the course of treatment. The psychiatrist Eugene Bliss describes treating patients with multiple personality as being like performing surgery without general anesthesia. As a result, the therapist may shy away from exploring the trauma, even when the patient is ready to do this. Additional complications of countertransference are to be expected with patients who have a complex post-traumatic syndrome. Especially with survivors of prolonged repeated abuse in childhood, the therapist may initially respond more to the damaged relational style of the survivor than to the trauma itself. Indeed, the origin of the patient's disturbance in a history of childhood abuse may be lost to the patient's awareness, and all too commonly it is lost to the therapist's awareness as well. Again, the traditional literature on borderline personality disorder contains some of the most subtle analyses of this complex countertransference. The patient's symptoms simultaneously call attention to the existence of an unspeakable secret and deflect attention from that secret. The first apprehension that there may be a traumatic history often comes from the therapist's countertransference reactions. The therapist experiences the inner confusion of the abused child in relation to the patient's symptoms. The rapid fluctuation in the patient's cognitive state may leave the therapist with a sense of unreality. Jean Goodwin describes a countertransference feeling of existential panic when working with survivors of severe early childhood abuse. Therapists often report uncanny, grotesque, or bizarre imagery, dreams, or fantasies while working with such patients. They may themselves have unaccustomed dissociative experiences, including not only numbing and perceptual distortions, but also depersonalization, derealization, and passive influence experiences. At times, the therapist may dissociate in concert with the patient, as in the case of Trisha, a 16-year-old runaway with a suspected but undisclosed history of extensive childhood abuse. In her first session with Trisha, the therapist suddenly had the sensation of floating out of her body. She felt as though she were looking down at herself and Trisha from a point on the ceiling. She had never had this feeling before. She surreptitiously dug her fingernails into her palms and pressed her feet against the floor in order to feel grounded. The therapist may also feel completely bewildered by the rapid fluctuation in the patient's moods or style of relating. The psychoanalyst Harold Searles notes that the therapist may have a strange and incongruous combinations of emotional responses to the patient and may be burdened with a feeling of constant suspense. This suspense actually reflects the victim's constant state of dread in relation to the capricious, unpredictable perpetrator. Reenactment of the dynamics of victim and perpetrator in the therapy relationship can become extremely complicated. Sometimes the therapist ends up feeling like the patient's victim. Therapists often complain of feeling threatened, manipulated, exploited, or duped. One therapist, faced with his patient's unremitting suicidal threats, described feeling like having a loaded gun at my head. According to Kernberg, the therapist's task is to identify the actors in the borderline patient's inner world, using countertransference as a guide to understanding the patient's experience. Representative pairs of actors that might figure in the patient's inner life include destructive bad infant and the punitive sadistic parent, the unwanted child and the uncaring self-involved parent, the defective worthless child and the contemptuous parent, the abused victim and the sadistic attacker, and the sexually assaulted prey and the rapist. Though Kernberg understands these actors as distorted, fantasied representations of the patient's experience, more likely they accurately reflect the early relational environment of the traumatized child. Rapid, confusing oscillations in the therapist's countertransference mirror those of the patient's transference. Both reflect the impact of the traumatic experience. Traumatic transference and countertransference reactions are inevitable. Inevitably, too, these reactions interfere with the development of a good working relationship. Certain protections are required for the safety of both participants. The two most important guarantees of safety are the goals, rules, and boundaries of the therapy contract and the support system of the therapist. We are going to take a break there because my brain is getting kind of tired. But just to summarize, right, to talk about this this chapter, or this part one of this chapter so far. The two things that they talk about obviously were transference and countertransference. And I guess what is important to know about transference and countertransference is both of those things exist because therapy is in and of itself just inherently, I'll use the word intimate, and I use that sensitively, right? I don't mean intimate in with any sort of negative connotation, right? But intimate in the sense that it's you and it's me, and you are sharing with me some really deep experiences. You're sharing with me some really deep and really personal things, which you might not share with anyone else, or might not have shared with anyone else, including significant others, or including other people who you consider close to you, right? The whole point of therapy, or the whole driving force of therapy, or at least the driving force of the positive change within therapy, is it's all derived from that place where you can trust me, right? That place where you can trust me with things that you might fear others wouldn't handle well, or others wouldn't necessarily interpret well, or they just might not validate you in the right ways, right? And that's why you're coming to me, right? You're needing somebody to tell you, hey, yes, your experiences were awful. Yes, your experiences were traumatic. Yes, your experiences created in you, or generated in you, this emotionality, or this mental health struggle that you have, and it's valid, right? It makes so much sense that you're responding the way that you are to what you are, what you experienced, right? And there's so much more to it, right? There's actually a lot of complexity to what is going on in the therapy room, and we'll talk about that more in the upcoming chapters and the upcoming parts of this chapter. But the fact that they started with transference and countertransference kind of intrigues me, because it's one of the, like, I don't know, it's one of the parts of therapy that is, if you present it the wrong way, right? If you don't present it carefully, it might be a deterrent, right? The idea that your therapist might be struggling to feel empathy for you, or might be relating your story and your feelings and your emotions to something in their life, right? And not having a positive reaction to it, could be a reason why you might not want to go, right? But like I said, I think the important takeaway is really that if that didn't happen, or if it wasn't a thing that happened enough in therapy that we were aware of it, you might have reason to worry that even a therapist is not willing to connect with you, right? That even a therapist wouldn't want to, alleviate or help validate those things in you that make you feel unapproachable, right? Things like that, right? Of course, amongst a number of other worries you might have. But I guess the takeaway from this section, this part of it, is it will get better if you are able to fully apply yourself to the therapeutic process, right? And this is something I actually tell my clients a lot, because it comes up, and I I happen to specialize in trauma and happen to see a lot of clients who have gone through some pretty horrific things, and I see this all the time. Right, there is a place. It's interesting because in one area, most of my clients, I would say, they started off trusting me pretty well, right? There's a pretty like considerable amount of trust. Pardon me. There's a considerable amount of trust in me from the start, considering all that they've been through, um, which certainly helped to propel things. But then there's always just that like tiny little bit of reservation, right? There's that tiny little bit of what they were talking about in I think the transference section, where um, the client recognizes that what they've gone through is horrific, right? And it was enough to just experience it. It was enough to just have it go through your brain and now be coursing through your body, right? Um, but to ask them to share that with somebody else at the risk of making them feel the same way, like that almost goes against human nature, right? It almost goes against human nature to say, yeah, this thing that damaged you, I want you to share it with me. you know, um, especially if there's already some of that trust or there's already some of that connection, right, within the therapeutic process, or the therapeutic relationship, right? You don't want to hurt me, and that's a good thing, right? The fact that I'm somebody or have become somebody in your life that you want to protect from what's hurt you, that means that there you do feel somewhat connected to me, right? But the whole point of all this is just to say that what you're what you're quote unquote walking into, right, when you enter into a therapeutic relationship with a therapist, um, is this two-way thing, right? It's not just me sitting back with my DSM-5 and just, spitting out random diagnostic questions and jotting down in my legal pad, different notes and just saying like every like other sentence, it's not this case where, it's not this situation where I'm distant and I'm just lofty or over here with all of my knowledge and I'm simply just trying to find a way to match a diagnosis to your story, right? It's so much more than that, right? It's this situation where you and I are meeting each other as two humans, right? Two humans who have some experience in life, and whether it's the same or opposite, um, the whole point is for you to be allowed a space where you're connecting with another human who all that they're meant to do is just to make you feel seen and heard and validated, right? Um, and if you don't think that goes a long way, I can tell you for a fact it goes a very long way. But that'll have to be, in another video. But again, like I said, the takeaway here is simply just if you're going through anything, whether it's trauma or depression or anxiety or whatever, it won't get better on its own, right? Um, Going to therapy will help. Going to therapy will, at the very least, give you a space to organize what you got going on, right? To put some things in boxes and take some other things out of the box and throw them in the dumpster, like just kind of like making your experience in life make a lot more sense and also helping you learn how to navigate it, which box to pull out, and which coping skill to pull out, and then but also too like how to conceptualize things, how to harbor all of what you got going on in a way that works for you, not against you, and like I said, at the very least, it's a space where you're talking to me and you're telling me all these things that, explaining all the things that you're holding, everything that's in, your backpack there. And me saying, yeah, what you got in that backpack, that's a lot of heavy stuff, right? That's a lot of stuff that's hard to carry when it's just one person, right? Or maybe it's not hard to carry because you're one person, but it's hard to carry because you don't have the right bin, or you don't have the right receptacle, right? You're trying to carry all these awkwardly shaped things in your arms and it's just not working, right? But it's not your fault, right? You were just handed a bunch of awkwardly shaped things in your life and asked to carry them, right? Again, I could go on this forever, but I am going to leave you guys with this, kind of just to summarize. There's so much hope waiting for you on the other side of that door. And if the idea of transference and countertransference is fearful to you, I understand that. Like, I'm not going to judge you for that. But know that that's also not, like, something that necessarily, like, shuts down a therapeutic relationship. In fact, I think in the next little part of this book, I think part 2 is going to start talking about how the therapist and the client work through something like that, and in fact use that either together individually, or can use that individually or together to improve the therapeutic relationship and have even more healing, have even more help. It's also going to mention like the therapist support system, like it mentioned, which again, that's more on us. That's our responsibility, right? To just be able to have a support system and being able to know how to deal with it when we have countertransference, right? But ultimately, you're in good hands, right? Of course, there are therapists who don't take the responsibility of being a therapist seriously. And we've got, we've certainly have people who have been harmed by that, but, you've got a majority of people, well over 90%, I would say, of therapists in the world who are good, genuine people and are going to do whatever they can to help you. So that all being said, I'm going to let you guys go. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in always. Be sure to check out the website. Be sure to look for any other videos, other content on the website that you might like. mentalwealthtoday.org. It's new and improved now. It's a lot easier to look at. But still, keep on interacting. I love the comments. I love the interactions on YouTube. And if you'd like, send me an email through the website or YouTube of some suggestions of any books or topics you want me to cover in future videos, and I'd be more than happy to. But with that, I'm gonna let you guys go. You guys take care of yourselves, and I'll see you guys in the next video.